Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Education Policy Institute's annual lecture, which the British Academy is delighted to support. I'm Dr. Molly Morgan-Jones, and I'm Director of Policy at the British Academy. The British Academy is the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. We mobilise these disciplines to understand the world and shape a brighter future. We do this by investing in researchers and projects across the UK and overseas, engaging the public with fresh thinking and debates, and bringing together scholars, government, business, and civil society to influence policy for the benefit of everyone. And I'm so delighted that today's speaker and today's session really embodies all of this and looks at such a critically important issue, international comparisons of education recovery. As I'm sure you're all aware, Professor Melanie Ehren is an extraordinarily well-respected and well-versed scholar in this area, and I, for one, am greatly looking forward to hearing her lecture and the following panel discussion, as I'm sure all of you are. And of course, this issue continues to be such a timely topic, ever more so today as it was last year, as we here in the UK, across the world, are still thinking about how we need to support children, young people, and our educational systems to cope with what continues to be the ongoing pandemic and the changed world we're all finding ourselves in, and children and young people are finding themselves in over the next few years. At the Academy, we've been doing a lot of thinking about this ourselves. Earlier this year, we published a report on the long-term societal impacts of COVID-19, and one of the core impacts that we called attention to was the lost access to education, training, and skills for people of all ages, including children and young people. But one message which remains clear is the crucial importance of education as the underpinning of our society. For the Academy, we are passionate about the role of education in opening opportunities to all young people, which is why we are so pleased to be able to work with the Education Policy Institute as it works to strengthen the evidence base, which will help us to understand what works for education, what we need to do to make sure that all children can access and benefit from education and from a broad and balanced curriculum within that. So I really look forward to hearing Melanie's lecture today, and now I'll hand over to Natalie Pereira, Chief Executive of the Education Policy Institute, for her opening words.
Thank you, Molly. So a huge thank you to you, Molly, and to your colleagues at the British Academy for supporting today's event. Welcome everyone to our annual lecture this afternoon. The Education Policy Institute is an impartial and independent research charity whose aim is to improve outcomes for all children and young people and to narrow the gap between the most disadvantaged and the rest. We do this through producing high quality, rigorous research that is designed to support policymakers and practitioners in tackling some of the most challenging issues relating to the education and well-being of young people. Our annual lecture provides an opportunity to hear from the best academics and thinkers from across the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has posed the biggest disruption to the lives of young people since the Second World War. And so it's important that we take this opportunity to come together, hear from experts, and reflect on what we have learned and what we can do better as the pandemic continues to affect all our lives. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Melanie Ehren to deliver our annual lecture today. Melanie is a professor in the governance of school and education systems, director of Research Institute Learn, and honorary professor at UCL's Institute of Education. Her academic work aims to contribute to a greater understanding of the interplay between accountability and the broader education system in tackling inequality and improving student outcomes. I first met Melanie many years ago when we gave evidence together to the Education Select Committee about the accountability system in England. She did then, as she does now, bring a wealth of expertise and insight in education, both in a UK and international context. After Melanie has delivered her presentation, she'll join our panel discussion along with Sir Kevan Collins, former Education Recovery Commissioner, and Evelyn Ford, a current head teacher and also the TES Head Teacher of the Year 2020. So please do hang on for our panel discussion, where there'll be an opportunity to pose questions to our panel members. As we proceed with the event today, do engage with us on Twitter using the hashtag EPI annual lecture. So I'll see you all in a few moments. In the meantime, I'm very pleased to hand over to you, Melanie.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction and opportunity to speak about international practices in repairing learning loss. Can I ask to share my slides? Brilliant, thank you. And please, next slide. So today I'll be talking about international practices in repairing loss, but I'll also go into detail and share some of the thinking and approaches that we've been taking in the Netherlands to repair learning loss. But before I go into both, I'd like to start by defining what we actually mean by learning loss, because this has been a particularly contentious term, not just in the Netherlands, but I also think I've seen some discussion about the use of the term in the UK. So I'd like to start by defining what we actually mean by that. Next slide. So when we talk about learning loss, we are comparing learning and development of children and young people in the period of the lockdown compared to previous normal years. And the question that we're asking ourselves is, are students learning less during lockdown than in a typical year? Next slide, please. Now, over the past 1.5 years, there have been numerous reports about learning loss. Many national studies have come out using standardized assessment tests to compare learning during lockdown to previous years. One of those studies is from the Netherlands, which I will be presenting later. But we've also seen a number of international studies which have also tried to predict learning loss using international surveys and modeling expected learning loss from previous research into the so-called summer slide and learning loss over a regular summer break. Now, an initial study by the World Bank, for example, used the amount of time of the school closures in various countries to model the drop in achievement in these countries. But these studies have, and these predictions are inherently inaccurate, as the time out of school in a summer holiday is not really the same as the time spent at home during the school closures. Many students will have received online education during the pandemic, and although that might have not been effective in the first lockdown, it will have improved in quality and accessibility over time as countries, for example, provided laptops to students, and teachers also became more skilled and equipped to teach online. So we really need kind of standardized student assessment tests within each country to understand the actual learning loss that will have taken place. Next slide, please. So the best estimates of learning loss are those which use standardized data to compare student outcomes pre and during pandemic and hopefully post-pandemic when we come out of it eventually. And given the fact that some student groups were disproportionately affected, or some subjects will have seen reduced teaching time, these outcomes also need to be disaggregated for different student groups, subjects, and school phases to really understand the learning loss from school closures. And I will talk about some of the initial outcomes from the Netherlands later in this talk. But obviously, learning loss is not the only topic that's on the agenda. We've seen various studies which have also looked at other types of consequences from the extended school closures and how these have affected students, with particular concerns over rising inequality, economic impacts, and also concerns over the well-being and socio-emotional development of students. But we've also seen quite a lot of changes, obviously, in how teaching and learning is organized, moving to online teaching, trying to understand which countries were better able to do that, or which schools, trying to understand how professional development was organized during school closures, and also how examination and assessment of students was affected in various countries. Looking at questions of teacher agency, their IT skills, and how they have transitioned to online teaching. And one particularly relevant group to point to here is the special interest group of the ICSE, the International Conference for School Effectiveness and School Improvement. And this was an initiative by Chris Chapman from Glasgow University, myself, and a number of other colleagues from Chile, who organized a number of online research labs with the international academic community to compare changes in some of these areas across the world. And we published a series of blogs from it. One, for example, looked at how inspections and inspectors of education were changing their methods and ways of working when schools were closed, and how we saw a shift across a number of countries in evaluating and controlling to what we call liaison, where they were really trying to bring various stakeholders and schools together to address some of the unintended consequences from school closures. So various topics that have been put on the agenda to think about the consequences of learning loss. And these topics that you see on the slides are were particularly on the agenda of high income countries, but various concerns also with particularly girls' access to education, or dropout of students out of school altogether, particularly in low and middle income countries. Next slide, please. And one study I would like to particularly highlight is one by Flemish colleagues De Witte and Smet, which was commissioned by the European Union to compare countries' additional spending on education during the pandemic. And they used Eurostat data and additional document analysis to calculate the additional spending on average and per student during the pandemic, and the percentage of increase in spending compared to past years. Now, unfortunately, the UK is not part of this table because it was funded by the European Union, and the UK wasn't part of it at the time of the study anymore. And also important to say is that these data need to be interpreted with caution, as they are somewhat inaccurate due to issues with translation or incomplete data, but they do give a good indication of which countries have particularly increased their spending and the categories that they allocated the spending to. And what you can see on this table is that the Netherlands, my own country, comes out on top here. And Portugal has also seen quite a big increase in spending, whereas some countries such as Slovakia, Romania, and Lithuania only marginally increased their budgets. And it will be particularly interesting to see if these differences in spending will also lead to further divergence of student outcomes internationally, such as, for example, measured in PISA and TIMSS. And that will give a good indication of whether the investments that are currently being made are actually effective in improving learning outcomes, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, and whether some of these investments have actually led to what's now being called building back a better system. So that leads us to actually look at how these countries are currently allocated these investments, which is on my next slide. So what you can see in this table, which is again from that EU-funded study by De Witte and Smet, is that most of the countries did not specifically earmark the budget to specific categories, but rather provided a lump sum to schools or perhaps other stakeholders, such as municipalities, to repair learning loss or kind of address other unintended consequences from the school closures. And the Netherlands is an example of this, where the Ministry of Education invited schools to apply for funding to organize catch-up programs. And I will talk about this particular program shortly. But what we also see from this table is that funding in some of the other countries was also used to buy laptops or tablets for students or ensure that they have internet access for online teaching and learning. And in some countries such as Italy and Wallonia, part of Belgium, we also see investments in protective equipment and cleaning, while a few countries invested in teachers, summer schools, or student counseling. So really a mixed picture of how funding was allocated and invested, which is probably even more varied if we actually look into detail into some of these countries. We can really expect different outcomes from this as well. Investing in protective equipment will particularly address kind of current concerns, whereas perhaps investing in teacher professional development will likely have more long-term effects as well. So it's an interesting kind of perspective to take when looking at building back a better system. So I'd now like to take a somewhat closer look to the Netherlands. As you remember, the Netherlands is a country with one of the highest additional investments in education during the pandemic to address learning loss, but also some of the other negative consequences from the school closures. Next slide. So in the Netherlands, we have seen two kind of substantial periods of school closures and lockdown. The first one was in between mid-March and early June 2020, when primary schools were closed fully for 13 weeks. And then we had 4 weeks of groups only going to school part of the week to allow for teaching smaller groups of children. In secondary education, we saw a longer period of school closures. 19 weeks schools were fully closed, and 19 weeks they were taught only part-time. And the second lockdown, which was fortunately shorter in time, was between mid-December and early February 2021. And in the Netherlands, we are really fortunate to have standardized assessment data in both primary and to some extent in secondary education as well, but particularly in primary education, with students taking tests in each grade in late January, early February, and again in June. And this allows us to measure their learning growth in each year and compare it to the growth of students in past years to see if their learning trajectory is different from before COVID. And schools were asked to upload their data to a national database, which is hosted and analyzed by colleagues of mine who are part of our research team at the University of Maastricht. And they also use this data to provide individual reports to school about the learning loss of their students across a number of subjects to help them in choosing appropriate interventions to catch up on lost learning. Next slide. So the figure on this slide provides a summary of the learning loss across 3 subjects as measured at the end of the first period of school closures. And what we see here is a reduction in learning growth across all three subjects, reading, spelling, and mathematics, compared to the year before the school closures. And what we see is that students made less progress in learning these three subjects, reading, spelling, and mathematics. And particularly in reading, they showed 25% less growth compared to the year before the lockdown. What is not shown on the slide, but included in the more detailed report, is that students with parents on low incomes and with a low educational background were disproportionately affected. Their learning trajectory was lowest compared to all of the groups of students. Next slide. But learning loss is only one of the consequences of the school closures. Another one arises from the cancellation of the standardized test at the end of primary education, which is used in the Netherlands to place students in the appropriate track in secondary education. So here is where the Netherlands is different from the UK. We have a highly tracked system for secondary education, which includes 10 different levels, which are organized in separate school buildings. And these 10 different levels are indicated on the top of the table on this slide, with the ones on the left starting with PRO/VMBO, qualifying for vocational education, and the one on the right qualifying for university entry. So it's on the left, it's what's considered the lowest level, and on the right the kind of highest ability level. And the table includes the percentages of students who are placed into each of these tracks in a number of years. And what you can see is an increase in placements into the kind of lower pre-vocational tracks, and a dip in placement into the more academic tracks in the year when the standardized test was cancelled in 2019-2020. And the numbers actually going back to normal in 2020-2021, when the standardized test was taken and included in the placement advice as normal. So in the year when placements dipped in 2019-2020, the advice for secondary education was only based on the teacher's advice and not including the standardized test. And what's important to see here is modeling that was done by the National Bureau for Statistics, which indicated that about 88% of students were likely placed in a track below where they would have ended up in a regular year. And this amounts to 14,000 students, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, who were placed in a lower track than in a regular year. So not being able to take the standardized test and improve their placement advice really disadvantaged these students, because their teachers tend to have lower expectations of their academic capabilities, and their placement advice would reflect that. So that's an important unintended outcome or consequence of the pandemic, and one that will have a great effect on their future school career, as they will have, we know that they will have difficulty in actually improving their life chances through a higher schooling trajectory. Next slide. But fortunately, it isn't just gloom and doom for every student, and particularly students who graduated from secondary education in 2019-2020 seem to have benefited from the school closures and the fact that their central exams were cancelled. And what you see on this slide is the percentage of students who graduated from secondary education over the past years where each of the lines represents a different track in secondary education. And across all tracks, there is a sharp incline in pass rates in 2019-2020, when their final standardized exams were cancelled and school-based assessments were now used to decide on their final grades. And in this year, they were actually allowed additional resits where the highest mark would count towards the end result, with an increase therefore in overall pass rates across all tracks. So this has also resulted in higher intake into university degrees, for example. Next slide. But given the widespread learning loss that we do see across both primary and secondary education, our national government initiated 5 calls for funding of catch-up programs to which schools could apply. And these calls were open to all schools in primary, secondary, vocational, and adult education, as well as the early years. So really a very broad spectrum of programs to address all educational levels in the Netherlands. And funding was given to schools on a lump sum basis. And this really reflects the Dutch system, which is quite decentralized, with a high autonomy for schools to decide on curriculum teaching and how to spend their budget in a regular school year. It's really a central feature of the Dutch system. So this approach to repairing learning loss really kind of follows how our system is organized, where funding is given to schools on a lump sum basis. And in this particular program, schools could apply for funding in 5 waves, and they were only required to specify the type of program or intervention they would implement and which students would be included in the program. And programs needed to be implemented before the 31st of December of this year. So all schools now are really in the middle of organizing these catch-up programs. Next slide. So my team from Learn, the Research Institute, and colleagues from the University of Maastricht, which you see on this slide, were commissioned to study the effectiveness of all the catch-up programs in primary and secondary education, and particularly the programs that were funded in the second wave. So were funded between August and September 2020, but which are currently still being implemented. Next slide. And in this second wave, schools could apply for funding of about 900 euros per student, with a maximum amount per school that was proportional to the number of students in the school with a low socioeconomic background. This is kind of a similar indicator as the one used for pupil premium in England, to give you somewhat of a reference. And for most schools, this would amount to approximately 10 to 20% of students in their school. And applying for the funding was voluntary. Schools who applied for the funding in this second wave all received it. No applications were rejected. And approximately half of the schools in both primary and secondary education did apply for it at that time. With an average amount of about 25,000 euro per primary school and approximately 130,000 euro per secondary school. Next slide. So in our research, we particularly looked at the type of program schools implemented, and this figure provides a summary overview of our analysis of the applications in primary education. And as you can see, most schools applied for funding to provide additional instructional support to students, both during and or after school hours. And this would be one-on-one tutoring or small group instruction provided by the classroom teacher or a teaching assistant, or oftentimes also by an external agency hired by the school. And particularly in secondary education, we see that schools would hire an external agency. And this also has to do with high teacher shortages in the Netherlands, where schools just simply don't have the capacity to, for example, increase teachers' contracts to provide this additional support. An important note to make here is also that many schools actually implement multiple programs or interventions. So, for example, they purchase specific materials to be used in tutoring, but then also train their teachers to use these materials. And sometimes they also put in place specific interventions or activities to improve parental support and involvement in homeschooling to ensure that these materials are effectively used at home as well. And this also means that some of these programs and interventions will have spillover effects to students who were not actively selected to participate in these interventions and tutoring. You might think of, for example, of teachers who have improved their skills and how those improved skills will obviously also benefit other students in their class who are not participating or were not kind of targeted in the applications as being part of catch-up work. Or where those students are going to additional tutoring and the teacher in the classroom doesn't actually have to spend time on ensuring they catch up with whole group instruction. So can actually spend that time with other students in their classroom. And in the interviews we've had with schools in our qualitative work, schools often also talk about these spillover effects and how they are particularly trying to choose programs which have a longer term sustainable effect on the quality of education in their schools, rather than just aiming for short-term catching up of a small group of students. So I think that kind of thinking is really important also when we think about long-term effects of how this funding might reduce, hopefully, inequality over time. Next slide. So when we look at the data from the same standardized assessments in primary education that I previously presented for the first lockdown, and when we use that same data to look at a learning loss in the second lockdown, it seems that these programs have actually had an overall positive effect in reducing the amount of learning loss in the second lockdown compared to the first lockdown. So what you see on this slide is the reduction in learning growth between 2020 and 2021 compared to the learning growth pre-COVID or in the first lockdown, apologies, both in percentages and in absolute scores. And this same figure for the first lockdown indicated a learning loss in reading of 25%, which is now reduced to 90%. In spelling, it was reduced from 14 to 7%, and in mathematics from 16 to 9%. So even though we still see a lower learning growth compared to before the lockdown, it's less so than in the first lockdown. So it seems that students are slowly catching up, which is good news. But again, we see that students with low educated parents or from low income backgrounds are catching up less so than other students. So these students still need our additional support. Next slide. So that picture I presented is a national picture, but we also analyzed, or a team from the University of Maastricht also analyzed these scores for schools who implemented catch-up programs and compared the learning growth of students who did and did not participate in a program or were targeted for a program. And this figure shows the learning growth of students 6 months into COVID and prior to participation in the catch-up program, and their learning growth 1.5 years into COVID after the introduction of the programs. And we compared their learning growth of students who did and did not participate in the programs and find that the gap between the two groups of students is actually closing, particularly in reading, numeracy, and spelling in the upper grades of primary education. Interestingly, we find that in the lower grades in primary education, the gap in spelling achievement, however, does not seem to close, but seems to have widened slightly. We're not quite sure yet why that's the case, but we're hoping to find out in further qualitative work. What we also can take from these figures is that students who were selected to participate in the catch-up programs did have lower learning growth at the start of the pandemic than the ones who did not participate in the programs. And this is indicating that schools did actually target students who needed to catch up most, which is also a kind of positive finding from this comparison. Next slide. So the high amount of funding with a decentralized approach with a high level of autonomy for schools really seems to have worked, or seems to work, in the Netherlands. But it also requires schools to make a purposeful and well-informed decision about which programs they will implement and why these are effective. And in our study, we therefore asked schools why they have chosen a specific program and why they think it will work. And one of the main explanations they give is that their program, and particularly the additional instructional support by one-on-one tutoring or small group tutoring, is effective because it allows students to reconnect to regular classroom instruction and the in-school curriculum. That's the kind of dominant theory of change that we would see in our interviews with school leaders. However, we also do see some other explanations, such as schools talking about how students' motivation and ability to self-regulate their learning is enhanced through specific programs, how that benefits their overall learning, or where programs improve teachers' skills to teach online and how that will have increased the effectiveness of teaching and learning, specifically during lockdown. We can also see these, or we can particularly see these as intermediate effects or conditions to improve learning outcomes in both the short and long term, as they will ultimately also benefit student learning. It's the kind of spillover effect that I was previously talking about. So an important lesson of our qualitative work is an understanding of how different activities and programs are connected to lead to improved learning, and also often need to address specific conditions that enable such learning, and how these might be varied by context and school and student population, and how it's really important that these decisions are being made at the school level, as it's teachers and school leaders who actually know the kind of the types of outcomes that need to be improved, the conditions that students are facing, where there are specific gaps that need to be addressed, and how they also need to work with parents, for example, to improve those outcomes. Next slide. We've done the same interviewing with school leaders in secondary education, looking at the programs they're implementing and why they think these are effective and under what conditions. And here the picture is more varied. Here we also see that reducing learning gaps to enable students to access in-school learning is one of the main reasons for why they think programs are effective. But schools also have chosen to implement programs to specifically prepare students for their final exams and how they expect this type of training to boost their self-confidence and motivation to prepare for these exams, how they prepare them to transition into higher education or vocational education. So a more of a mixed picture of what schools are trying to do to address the kind of unintended outcomes of school closures. We're currently testing these theories of change in qualitative case studies to really understand whether this is actually what makes these programs effective and to share that learning across schools in the Dutch education system. And that really brings me to the end of my talk to talk about some of the current policies being put in place to address learning loss and also to address the widening achievement gaps that we are expecting. Next slide, please. And these additional policies and investments fall in what is called by our national government a national program for education. Again, with large investments in all educational sectors and not just schools this time, but also municipalities working to improve education, such as by funding programs to tackle youth employment, support students in vocational education and training to transition into the labor market, or funding municipalities to organize programs to reduce early school leaving, counseling and job coaching to students, or organize programs for specific skills training. Next slide. However, the pandemic, not just in our country, but in other countries as well, is really kind of flagging where there are structural issues in our system and how these cannot necessarily only be repaired with this type of additional funding, which is really kind of addressed at short-term catching up, mitigating short-term effects of school closures. They don't really address kind of more structural issues in our system, which lead to high inequality. And in the Dutch system, that is particularly through tracking in secondary education, which disadvantages low-income students or students from migrant backgrounds. It also doesn't address the high teacher shortages, the high levels of school segregation that we see in some cities through free school choice by parents. It also doesn't address examples of schools still making decisions very intuitively on how to improve education. Those are some of the kind of main issues in our education system, but the pandemic is really putting them to the fore and putting them on the agenda and providing an opportunity about how some of these wider structural issues can now be addressed, such as by introducing comprehensive first 3 years of schooling in secondary education. There's this discussion about entry requirements into teacher education. And we've also seen during the pandemic many research practice partnerships arising, academics working with schools to provide them with more expertise and knowledge and evidence from research on how to repair learning loss, but also improve the quality of teaching overall. And some of these partnerships have also been implemented on the national level, where I was, for example, part of an impact team with the Council for Primary Education, where we really worked with school boards to think about some of the policies that they could implement to improve teaching and learning in their schools. So it's these kind of initiatives that arose during the pandemic that will hopefully sustain over time and allow us to actually build back a better system. So hopefully we won't only see a kind of rising inequality as a result of the pandemic, but also changes to the system that will allow to reduce those inequalities over time. That's my talk for today. And hope for a fruitful discussion to think about how some of these lessons are relevant for the UK or for school leaders in your context.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Melanie. There are so many findings there and information there that I'm really looking forward to picking up on as we move into our panel discussion. For those of you joining the webinar this afternoon, please do feel free to put your questions to the panel in the chat bar on Zoom. We'll try and get to as many of them as we possibly can before we close the event at 5:30. So I'd like to introduce you now to the rest of our panel members. First off, we have Evelyn Ford, who is the head teacher of Copthall School, a highly regarded academy with a comprehensive and culturally diverse intake in northwest London. Evelyn is a member of the Council of the Association of School and College Leaders, or ASCL, and in this role, Evelyn is chairing a new network for BAME leaders and setting out to improve the proportion of school leaders from BAME backgrounds. As I mentioned earlier, Evelyn has won the TES Head Teacher of the Year award in 2020. So huge welcome to you, Evelyn. Our other panel member is Kevan Collins. Kevan recently served as England's Education Recovery Commissioner. Prior to that, Kevan was CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation. Between 2005 and 2011, Kevan was Chief Executive and Director of Children's Services in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, one of England's most diverse and disadvantaged communities. Kevan started his career teaching and leading schools in East London and Yorkshire and became the National Director of the Primary National Strategy in 2002. Kevan also chairs the Youth Endowment Fund and is a visiting professor at the University College London Institute of Education and was knighted for his services to education in 2015. We're really looking forward to hearing more from all three of you. I'm going to ask for Evelyn and Kevan first to give us about 3 to 5 minutes of opening remarks and reflections from Melanie's presentation. So if we go to you first, please, Evelyn.
Thank you. I thought that was fascinating. I think as a school leader, you know, kind of foot soldier on the ground, just to kind of hear that comparison, I just thought was amazing. And obviously lots for us to learn, I think, from our kind of colleagues across the water. But I think if I'm thinking about the UK, I think firstly, I think it's really important to acknowledge the phenomenal work that has taken place by school and college leaders, particularly as we thought we were beginning to emerge from the pandemic, only now to find ourselves in this real precarious situation of potentially actually going backwards. I think that school and college leaders have been flexible, have been agile. They've been able to adapt and repurpose their schools to accommodate everything that was coming at them. But as a school leader, and like school leaders everywhere, I think what we did, you know, similar to what we've just heard, is that, you know, we did spend a lot of time reviewing our curriculum to ensure that there was breadth and depth as we attempted to bridge the learning loss that had taken place. But what was front and centre for us at Copthall, as I'm sure other schools as well, was really just trying to understand the individual issues that our young people had faced. So it wasn't just about the learning loss, it was really about that wraparound care, that real wraparound pastoral care that we feel that our young people need. And all of that continue to happen against the shocking funding given to schools in the UK, particularly when we just compare that with what we've just heard in the Netherlands. So for me, the rise in mental health issues and behaviour issues is really coming to the fore at the moment. And I think, you know, schools are those places where young people form those real positive and long-lasting friendships, and they take time, and our young people haven't had the time to do that, and those are now beginning to emerge, and I think that's a real issue. And then finally, I know this is going to come up in the conversation, and I know that whilst we can never put a price on making our education system better for every child, but I think what we can do in the UK is so much better. We have to do better, particularly for our disadvantaged young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Kevin, over to you, please.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks, Melanie and Evelyn, to really good inputs. I think just 5 quick points from me. I think the first is something, just pick up what Evelyn just said. The story hasn't yet been written in relation to COVID. We have to recognise that this is, and you know, the last couple of weeks have taught us again, this is ongoing. This is a kind of new sort of way of living. We're not out of it. So the story's not yet been written, so it's an ongoing issue. The second point for me is that the legacy is still in play. It's going to be determined by what we do nationally and locally. I think it will shape not only the lives of individuals, but will shape the place of English education over the next decade, how we decide to respond to this. And we know that matters not only in terms of attainment, but it matters, and all the evidence is there from other examples. It will matter in terms of personal earnings throughout your life. It'll matter in terms of the national economy. So how we respond nationally and personally will matter to this. The third point, I think, is picking up on this, the amazing work schools and communities have done and are doing. There's no one like the school system to pick up the pieces of failed government. We make it work, we put it together, and that is what we're seeing. Schools have mitigated, I believe, quite a lot of the risk, but not all of it. And particularly the issue for us is variation. The schools facing the greatest challenges, serving the hardest to teach children in many ways, are the ones that have done the most work, but they haven't mitigated all the risk. It just isn't only for schools to respond to. And that leads to my fourth point, that the schools and community response has been amazing, but the national endeavour and leadership has been poor. There's almost been an abdication of national leadership to respond to this matter. I believe you need, in response to this, a sort of national endeavour, a sort of collective effort, not leaving people alone to try and sort it out for themselves. And it feels like increasingly we're being left to sort it out alone. Classically, you have the accountability framework, you have the challenge and support. We're seeing nationally the challenge bit come in, but where's the support bit of the equation? The bit that, that bit that really matters. So where's the national programme, which is what it's called, as Melanie told us, in the Netherlands? Where is the national endeavour? I personally don't think it's there, and the leadership isn't there. And finally, I'm left with thinking the response needs to be broad. It needs to be academic and non-academic. I think we heard that very clearly. It needs to be all ages in the broad, from the earliest years all the way through to 19. So we need a broad response. We're not hearing enough about that in England. It needs to be school-led. Absolutely, the evidence is that you need to learn this, work this out in terms of the impact by very local, if not child levels, and how you respond to it. So it has to be school-led. And that, for me, would indicate school recovery, if you like, plans with funding to support them, the way that we were seeing in the Netherlands, where you can create your package bespoke to the needs, but you have the support to do it. It needs to be long-term. We need to be thinking over at least 2 or 3 years for this sort of work. Our disruption, we have to remind ourselves, 115 days on average of missed face-to-face education. As you said, Natalie, nothing like it since the Second World War in terms of disruption. And finally, I think it needs to be very targeted. The impact on disadvantaged communities, not only of education, but actually in health, in economic terms, has been profound and way out of kilter from what it's been from the more advantaged communities. And so we need to respond in a way that is targeted. We've got mechanisms, we've got the pupil premium, and we've got other ways of doing that. So they're just a few opening remarks, Natalie.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Evelyn and Kevin. I'm going to bring Melanie back in now. Melanie, before we get to some of the kind of bigger policy questions, there are a couple of clarification questions that's come in from the audience. So we've got one from Amy, who has asked, she said, you mentioned that the exam for students at the end of primary were cancelled. Were the standardised tests you mentioned cancelled for any other years? And did you, i.e. the Netherlands, have to change at all how you assessed their development, or did all of those exams manage to go ahead as planned?
Yeah, so in primary education, as I mentioned, we have 2 assessments in every grade, and then a final assessment in the end of primary education, the last year of primary education. And only that last one was cancelled, but the other assessments some of them were postponed. So students took these when they were back into school after the lockdown, and then CITO, which is the national organization who calculates all these all the scores and outcomes, used a kind of standardization to take into account the change in date when these assessments were taken, to ensure that the scores are equivalent to the scaling in the previous years.
Thank you. And just one more clarification question from Susanna, who said, I think you said, Melanie, that disadvantaged young people who were transitioning into secondary education were further disadvantaged by teacher recommendations, whereas those graduating from secondary education received higher grades than they would have done. How do you account for that?
Yeah, so that can be explained by the fact that in secondary education, the cancellation of the standardized assessment also saw another change, which was that students could take multiple resits on their school exams, and only the highest mark counted. So they were actually giving more opportunities, where also the highest mark counted for their final outcome, and that wasn't the case in primary education.
Thank you, Melanie. Do keep your questions coming into the chat. I'm going to bring in Evelyn and Kevin. We've had a question from Ehren, who has picked up on the point that Melanie made in her presentation, that there has been less intuitive decision-making by teachers and leaders. What are both of your views on whether this is the situation in England? We'll go to Evelyn first and then Kevin.
Thank you. I think in England, actually, I think I can only obviously speak from a kind of local level. I think that, teachers and leaders have been really intuitive, actually. I think in terms of knowing our communities and knowing the local context, I think that, and I think there's something about, are we more risk averse? And, I don't actually think we are. I think that, we're working against the backdrop of things like Ofsted, the accountability measures and so on. But I actually think that that leaders have really stepped up to the plate, actually. I think that they know their communities, that they are, if we're talking about taking risks, I think they're putting their, the little money that they have where their mouth is, really knowing where to target those funds. So from my local kind of context level, I think that we are very intuitive, actually. We know what our young people need. And I think we're actually tired of listening to what ministers have to say about it, because they are not the foot soldiers on the ground. They're not in the schools, they're not in the classrooms. So I think we are being ultra intuitive in terms of what the needs are. That's just my view.
Thank you. Kevan, is that your reflection too from what you've seen? And do you think there's a tension between teacher intuition and the evidence?
I don't think so. I think there's one thing about being very keyed into your children and understanding the issue that they present you, that there's that sort of level of intuition, if you like, knowing your children well, knowing your communities really well, which I think is essential if you're going to respond well. So listening to our children, diagnostic assessments. Then I think what has happened in England in the last decade is the access to information about what you might do with that. Yeah. How you respond to that is better. And I'd say that, wouldn't I, from the EF's background, that there is more kind of insight to support you in making a decision. But we must always start with people who really know their children deeply, and the job of whoever it is that provides, evaluations of what works and what doesn't must be to serve that intuition by saying, here's information. Because I think it's, there is knowledge and there is information out there. And I think what's happening in many schools is people are willing to turn to that and to listen to that as they then make the decision-making process. That an informed professional, I think, is what we're seeing more and more of.
Thank you. Melanie, do you want to add anything to
yeah, maybe just picking up on that point of an informed professional, because I think that's really key. And using multiple sources of data to really know children and what they need. And that's something different to me than intuition. Because what we've seen, particularly with the kind of the placement advice of students into secondary education, is that there are kind of certain views of which students will do well in higher academic tracks and which won't. And when that's only based on perceptions, instead of using multiple sources of data to actually check, is my perception accurate? Am I providing or coming up with the best advice for these students to go into secondary education? That's where we've seen some of the detrimental effects of the cancellation of standardized assessments. So it's the informed professional that we need, who recognizes that he or she needs multiple resources to really understand the child, and where a child can do better, or his or her capabilities to do well in education, that's required. And oftentimes, we all are often not aware of the particular biases that we might have. And we do all need different data and information resources to really make those decisions about individual children. So I think that that's really important to take into account.
Thank you, Melanie. We've had a couple of questions relating to specific vulnerable groups of children that I'm going to put to Melanie and then to Evelyn first, and Kevan, do come in afterwards if you want to. So a question from Stephen first about whether there's any international evidence on the impact of the pandemic on disabled children and those with special educational needs. And then also a similar theme from Caroline, this time looking at the impact and support for families, Melanie, in your case, for those with Dutch as an additional language, but I guess also to Evelyn, what your experience has been for families where English is an additional language.
Yeah, so on the first question about international evidence around how the pandemic has impacted special needs education or children with special needs, I know that UNICEF did a couple of studies in this particular area. I think I've seen some work published by them specifically. I don't know the outcomes of that particular work, but we'll be happy to follow up on it. In terms of children who don't have Dutch as their first language, I guess that's also a benefit of having a decentralized school-led approach, because the schools that would have many of those students or would have those children would be able to particularly organize programs where those children are supported. And we've seen many schools actually implementing programs to work with these children. Because what they were saying as well is that another effect of the lockdown is that these children are now at home and are not engaged in conversations in Dutch because their parents often don't speak Dutch at home. So even not having the opportunity to be taught how to speak Dutch, they also don't have any opportunities to actually actively practice speaking and reading in Dutch. So schools have organized programs, particularly with these groups of students as well. And then again, the school-led approach also allows them to choose specific approaches to connect with parents and help them help them teach their children at home. They would know which particular parents struggle to support home or to do homeschooling with their children. I mean, I've seen examples on Twitter where teachers were actually cycling across town to just say hi to students and see what's going on at home at students' homes where students were not connecting online, for example, and where they really had concerns about children just completely dropping off because parents weren't able to support them at home. So they would know which parents need additional support and how to provide that to them. And sometimes they've done that through just bringing parents together in WhatsApp groups, or they have just had a dedicated team to constantly reach out to parents and used funding for that kind of support as well. So again, this is also an approach that needs to be led by schools because they know which parents need that support and what kind of support they actually need, and what's preventing them from really supporting their children in learning at home.
Thank you. Evelyn, I could see you nodding there at points. What's your experience been on both the impact and support for these vulnerable groups?
Yeah, I can definitely talk to the EAL because that kind of really resonates with me here at Copthall. We have a high number of EAL students in our school. And I think if I just reflect on school closure and very much echoing what Melanie has just said, it's that it was the ability of those parents to be able to support their children. And that obviously made opportunities for learning gain. It was very unequal because you had groups of parents who couldn't access the remote teaching that our teachers were doing. So that became a real issue. And that language barrier to accessing remote learning was an immense challenge. And that whole idea about immersing yourself in the English language, again, that wasn't able to happen. So what's my view on how we can begin to improve on that? I will always talk about funding, and I think that, you know, our teachers, we need bespoke training actually to be able to build those skills, those teaching approaches to really support the language development of our EAL students. But the funding is so complex and it doesn't make that easy for them. I really liked what you said about a WhatsApp group for families. I think that's a great idea. You know, one of the things that we've done here is we've really put a very small amount of additional funding into EAL, particularly because our numbers are rising. You know, every day we're getting new admissions. So really thinking about how we can tailor that very small pot of money to those groups that need it most. And just to talk very quickly about SEND young people and the impact, we have found, particularly at our school, that the attendance gap for our SEND students is wide. So not only did they struggle under lockdown, they're also now struggling to actually return to school. And then you layer that with mental health concerns, that just has become a real issue for us. So it's definitely a challenge. And, you know, we go back to that funding. Schools just need it directed to them through the pupil premium funding so that we can target that support most appropriately.
Thank you, Evelyn. I'm going to come back to funding in a moment. Kevan, did you want to comment on any of those?
Just one very quick point, Natalie, and that is I think that this bit of the conversation takes you into the issue around beyond school partnerships. So, you know, this has revealed the best and the worst in our system, and the worst bits are some of the withering support for youth services, family support, and the closure of children's centres, the underfunded mental health services and CAM support we need. So I think part of the response is not what schools can do, but what schools do in partnership with others. And it's revealed how patchy that framework is, and that support is, and that's particularly important for the more vulnerable children and for those who we're, you know, quite rightly thinking, because one of the other issues, of course, is that we obsess in the data around reading and maths, but that's such a tiny part of a child's life, and that doesn't capture at all what's happened to children in special schools and some of the other children who weren't able to access some of the assessments we've used nationally for that. And just one thing someone's asked me in the chat, in that column, that the table that we were shown, where would England sit? I think it's segregated into your funding. I think we'd probably sit in the 6 to 7% funding line. You know, we're about £500 a child against the £795 a child that the Netherlands received per child to support this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to turn, so that was a question that was raised by Tom Atwood. So Tom, EPI has calculated that it's about, England recovery funding is about £490 extra per pupil. There's more analysis on our website that looks at some of the international comparisons as well. So do have a look there. While we're on the issue of funding, Kevan, we've also had a question from Rachel who says it's, you know, it's quite pessimistic, the kind of England's efforts in relation to funding. Spending review has come and gone. What opportunities are there now to influence government and advocate for more support?
Well, I guess personally there aren't many, because as people on the call may or may not know, I decided to resign because the government wouldn't fund our recovery in the way that I thought our children deserved. You know, I think we have to take every opportunity. And by the way, this is against a backdrop of a decade of school budgets being squeezed, and we're only at where we were 10 years ago. And the latest data is showing us that from IFS, I think today, showing us that disadvantaged communities and schools have actually been hardest hit in funding compared to others. So I don't want to be pessimistic about it, but I think we have to keep making the case. And the case that's really important for me is not just the case for the individual child, that's the most important, but the case for the recovery will be crucial to Britain's economic long-term prospects. You know, all the analysis shows you that when you fail to recover, that has a hit on your own national economy. So you're not spending, you're investing in recovery. And I think the figures that we all see as conservative are that this, you know, at least £100 billion is the cost of not recovery. It goes as high, way up into the hundreds and hundreds of billions. So I'm being really kind. I think the IFS said it's about 300 billion. So this isn't about spending, it's about investing in the future, not only of the children, of course, but in the future of our economy, which we all know is fundamentally important. We have to keep making the case.
Thank you, Kevin. We've got a great question from Loic on how schools in the Netherlands have or maybe haven't partnered with other parts of the children's sector, so building a bit on what Kevin was talking about. Yeah, Melanie, are you happy to take that one?
Yeah, so there are 2 points to make here. The first one is that as a regular part of our system, we have networks for inclusive education. So all schools in the Netherlands in primary and secondary education are part of a network for inclusive education, which constitutes kind of mainstream schools as well as schools that provide special education. And the idea is that these schools collaborate to ensure that students can stay in their school, they're in a mainstream school as much as possible, where kind of psychologists or other specialist teachers come into the school to provide the support that they need, rather than have them go to special needs schools. That's kind of the idea behind it. So that structure was already in place and was obviously quite important to have to address some of the issues around well-being as well during the pandemic. But then the fact that we have a decentralized approach to catching up also allowed schools to buy in that additional support beyond that network. So we have seen that schools who have students with mental well-being concerns buying in programs that will particularly address that. So working with a range of external providers who offer that support to students. And the argument there is also that this will affect learning in academic subjects. We often tend to separate the two, but obviously a student cannot learn in school if he or she feels anxious or depressed or angry, and not just on the individual level, but that also has an effect on classroom climate, as we have heard from teachers who are saying that if we have a large number of students, or even one or two in a classroom who are not doing well, they show disruptive behavior, and that just reduces effective teaching time for other students as well. So it has a big impact on outcomes in academic areas as well, which is an important finding, I think, to take into account when we think about catching up.
Thank you. Evelyn, one of the concerns that we've had in EPI with regards to the government's recovery package, one of many concerns, is that there hasn't been much, if any, focus on well-being, particularly in schools. What has been your experience of the impact of the pandemic on young people's well-being? And can you share any insights as to how you've tried to manage that?
Yeah, thank you. again, I echo what Melanie said, because my view is that students who are not well are just not going to attend, and then you get a vicious circle. So if you're not well enough, you're not going to attend, you're not going to have the ability to catch up, and then everything just gets harder and harder. So for me, mental health and well-being should be the DNA that runs through every school. And I think that the funds need to go right at the heart of all these issues, that this pressure cooker has now been released and schools are facing some real serious challenges around high rates of anxiety, you know, particularly about sitting exams now when they didn't for the past 2 years. That is causing immense stress. In our context, suicide ideation is becoming an emerging issue, and not one that teachers have the skills to deal with. And I think that's a massive issue. And we need training, and we need the expert support to really manage these challenges that are coming through. In terms of at my local level, you know, I'm really grateful that I'm able to employ non-teaching heads of years. I've got a full-time counsellor, and we also draw heavily upon volunteer counsellors, because, you know, they just add that capacity to really help. Now, wouldn't it be amazing if every school in the UK had an on-site provision like the Place to Be, who offer that real bespoke and tailored mental health and well-being support? And I actually think that is key. I think that unless the government recognise that that's where we need to channel a substantial amount of money, we're not going to have well children. We're going to have high absentee rates. We're not going to be able to close that, the learning loss that is there. And goes back to Kevin's point about society just generally. You know, what's our economy? What is our country going to be like unless we have well young people in our schools?
Thank you. I want to come on in a moment, if we can, to teacher training and school leadership. But Kevin, I'll come on to you.
Yeah.
Actually, do you want to come in first if you've got just?
Yeah, it was just Evelyn prompted me to say just two things. I really hope one thing that has happened, and it links to Melanie's point as well, that we've put to bed forever this arid and facile distinction between skills and children learning to be learners and knowledge. It has not helped us at all to see these things as being in competition with each other. And what we've learned again, we knew this already, but been reinforced through this experience is it's the whole child, it's the whole brain, it's the whole learning experience that matters. And we must understand that you achieve when you're ready to learn. You feel safe and secure, and you have the habits and skills of learning, whether it's self-regulation or metacognition, whatever it might be. So I hope it moves us on from that, because I'm not quite sure that our accountability system and our way of making assessments has caught up with that understanding of the child, because the recovery isn't necessarily education. The recovery is the recovery of childhood. Whether you're teenagers and you just haven't had time out and about with your mates hanging around at bus stops, which is actually really part and parcel of growing up a teenager, or an early years child spending time playing with your friends for 2 years, this is all part of childhood which has been disrupted. And it's the whole child that we need to think about. And I'm not quite sure our system, and particularly our accountability of our system, has yet captured that and appreciated. That's why we're addressing these priorities in the round.
Thank you, Kevin. I love what you just said about it's the recovery of childhood. That's such an important lens to look through. I wanted to come on briefly to the role of inspection, given the expertise we've got in this virtual roundtable. So Tim Coulson has asked whether we've learned anything from inspections internationally. So I'll come to you in a moment, Melanie, to answer that. But I'm also interested in Kevin and Evelyn's views on what role inspections should play in the midst of a pandemic. So I'll go Melanie, Kevin, and then Evelyn.
Yeah, so in the chat, I posted a link to a number of blogs that we published on the role of inspection in the pandemic. And this is actually the result of a series of webinars that we organized with ICSI, the International Community of Academics and Practitioners, which included inspectorates of education across a number of countries. Where we actually exchanged experiences across countries and saw huge differences in how inspection agencies were responding to the pandemic. Some of them just halted inspections or tried to understand how schools were moving to online teaching by changing their ways of monitoring of schools. And then kind of providing thematic reports where they try to share practices across schools. But we've also seen examples such as in Wales, which really moved to what we call the liaison role, where they established head teacher boards in regions with inspections on those bodies to really understand the challenges that schools were facing and to share experience across the system. So really putting in place a structure of collaboration and exchange of good practice. And where they would use those insights to kind of feed into national policy making. We've seen great examples from Chile as well, who just opened a helpline for schools and provided them with online teaching materials. So really took a far more supportive role than they usually had. So we have seen some great examples, but also examples of systems that didn't really change much, just chose to do monitoring in other ways by telephone or emailing. Yeah, most of the systems seem to be going back to normal now. It would be interesting to do a follow-up to see if the rules have actually changed for long term, but we don't know yet.
Thank you, Melanie. Kevin, what role do you think inspections should be playing now?
Well, it should be playing, in my view, the role that it always should be playing, which is helping us to become the best system in the world at getting better. That's the task, just to be good at getting better. So the question we ask then, is what we're currently doing helping us get better, or is it actually driving fear and stymieing innovation, or is it causing people to become, as someone said earlier, risk averse? So the worst thing in the world is the idea that we plow on and we get to a culture where you're not allowed to mention COVID. You cannot have this level of disruption to a system and not understand and talk about it, because the compassion is not only for the children, but for school leaders and teachers. It's been incredible what they've done. The idea that you go and actually deliver meals for children as part of your response, and we don't understand that as part of a compassionate system, to me is surprising. So I test it by, is it helping us become the best at getting better? And I have to say, I'm sorry, I don't think we are the system at the moment that is the best at getting better, which is obviously where I want us to be.
Thank you. Evelyn.
Natalie, don't get me started. So I will be brief, but as a school leader, I fully echo what Kevin has just said. I don't think it's helpful. I think there's high stakes accountability for school leaders who have gone above and beyond. We've spoken about mental health of young people. Let's think about the mental health of school leaders, and how helpful is it when you have an inspectorate that comes in and does not take COVID into account. I think it's unforgivable unforgivable, and I think it is so unhelpful. There appears to be no thought given to the context of what a school is going through at a time of an inspection. And, you know, we're hearing of inspectors coming in when you've got a whole maths department out, when you've got, you know, half of your English department out and the head's not in the building and they're still ploughing on. So is it helpful? No, it is very unhelpful. And I would finish by saying, rather than give Ofsted 25 million to check up on schools, give that 25 million into schools for those very needy young people that actually need it. So no, they're not helping at the moment.
Really clear and compelling. Evelyn, I love it. Thank you. We're coming to the end of our panel and Q&A discussion. I'm so disappointed because there are lots of questions and themes that that we haven't been able to get into. Before I wrap things up, I want to ask each of the panelists for just one bullet point on what you think is the most important lesson that we have learned as a result of the pandemic. So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to think about that while I say thank you again to the British Academy for supporting today's event. Thank you to everybody who has joined us online. All of your great questions, feedback and contributions. Please do keep following us on Twitter. You can keep up to date on our website as well, epi.org.uk. Sign up to our newsletter through that so you have notification of all our forthcoming events and research. And just a final thank you from me to Kevan, to Evelyn, and most of all to Melanie for delivering a fantastic 2021 annual lecture. Thank you so much. I'm going to go around very quickly and ask for your most important lesson learned. And if we go Evelyn, then Kevan, and then give Melanie the final word.
I think the lesson learned actually comes from the Children's Commissioner. This is not a snowflake generation. This is your roll up your sleeves generation of young people who have had immense challenges. And I think that everybody needs to remember that.
Thank you. Kevan.
Notwithstanding all the talk about the future of education, nothing replaces the value of a broad education experience in school.
Thank you, Melanie.
And the final note from me then is to say that this really requires a collective response, and we cannot just leave it up to schools to repair learning loss and think about how to reduce inequality. This really needs to be a collective responsibility and effort, really.
Thank you so much. A real privilege to be joined by such an esteemed panel. Thank you for your time, and thank you to everyone for attending. Good evening.